Hi, my name is Sanjeev. I work in Qualcomm Research. I cover product management for all the cellular projects within Qualcomm Research and work closely with our chip group and other parts of Qualcomm. So the talk today in your booklets is titled 5G or 5G Vision. But in order to understand what we're doing with 5G, I'd like to explain a little bit about what we're doing with LTE and its evolution, because those are fairly closely tied in terms of what we're trying to do with cellular connectivity. So from a Qualcomm perspective, you can broadly consider three major areas that we're looking at from an innovation, research, and productization perspective. The first one is related to connectivity, and it's basically aims to solve the 1000x problem, as we call it. And so we coined this term a few years ago, saying that if you doubled data demand twice every year, it'll take about 10 years to get 1,000 times increase in data demand, and how do you basically provide solutions to meet that data demand? Your mileage may vary as far as the 2x factor in the 10-year term, but you get the general idea that the things that we do with our smartphones and devices is causing a huge surge in data demand. And so some of the solutions we're putting into place to address this data demand tsunami are the following. Make as efficient a technology as we can, be that Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, or cellular. Bring the transmitter and receiver closer together, so basically densify the network, as we say. And that basically allows us to reuse spectrum that is bought or leased or given to cellular operators for a certain geography for a certain period of time. We can reuse that spectrum at pretty much every small cell node, as opposed to the kind of macro cell networks that are more common today. And then speaking of spectrum, it costs operators quite a bit of money in those countries like the US, where they have to pay for spectrum. And so why not tap unlicensed spectrum, which is free and has been put into place by governments to push innovation in connectivity. So we're taking what are traditionally cellular technologies and applying them to unlicensed spectrum as well. So that covers kind of the 1000x piece of the equation. The second thing is, so the 1000x demand can be expressed in terms of data demand for applications that we typically are concerned with today. What cellular is also doing is opening up into new areas, and that's kind of the creating the connectivity fabric for everything. So Internet of Things is one of the aspects that cellular is expanding into, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later in the presentation. The third area is then marrying compute, input, and output to that connectivity. So sensors for input, compute to chew on the data that these sensors are producing, and you send it out to output, be it video, audio, or whatever other form it takes, and then rinse and repeat. So that's another area to make things more intelligent and connect things up. So within the context of connectivity, we're currently in what's called the fourth generation of 4G era. So pretty much cellular connectivity takes a new generation once every 10 years, starting even from 1G, which was analog voice, to digital voice, to 3G, which was more efficient voice, but also with some broadband connectivity. And then 4G really brought the data connectivity that we know of today. And so 2020, it's going to be time for one more generation, and so 5G is going to come into early deployment in the 2020 timeframe. And the reason why this progression of almost one generation every decade kind of applies is for there are multiple reasons. One is we cook up new reasons to have connectivity. So analog voice became digital voice, made it more efficient. But then mobile broadband really was a new reason to have a new generation. The second reason is technology makes a leap every so many years down at the silicon level, at the RF level, et cetera. So we want to build a new technology that takes into account this leap in technology. Now you may say, hey, technology changes really fast. Why don't we do it every 1 or 2 years as technology makes these leaps and bounds? Well, people can't afford to invest in a whole new network every 3 or 4 years. Operators in the US, for example, spend in the order of billions, $5 to $10 billion every year upgrading and maintaining their network. So a 10-year period is a good time over which to put out an entirely new network. So if we look at where we stand today, connectivity is provided through what are called macro cells, or the cell towers which you may or may not observe around the highways and on buildings, etc. And also small cells to your left, which are being introduced more readily, both within buildings as well as outdoors into shopping malls and stadiums and other venues. And so we're using 4G LTE, introducing LTE in unlicensed spectrum, and of course ubiquitous Wi-Fi to provide connectivity to devices which we term multi-mode devices, because they support a whole load of radios. Support cellular, support 4G, 3G, sometimes 2G. You have Wi-Fi, you got Bluetooth, you got NFC, and so on and so forth. So that's where we stand today. And as 5G gets introduced, you can introduce it more surgically. So as the operator's budget enables them, so they have a few $1 billion maybe every year, as I mentioned, to spend, they can spend it in the areas that need that connectivity and the data usage the most. So it could be dense areas, it could be dense cities. Over time, moving into suburbia, maybe in the US you have to cover suburbia first, and then moving further out into rural. So right now we have pretty much a nationwide 4G network from the prominent operators in the developed countries. And as the emerging countries are moving from 3G, they're gradually adopting 4G. And so similarly, we'll see with 5G operators putting their investment and limited capex budget into those areas that need it the most. What refers to 6 gigahertz and so forth refers to the spectrum bands, the RF bands that are used for communication. And what has happened is the lower bands are like beachfront property, and everyone goes and grabs that. Some new beachfront property comes available every once in a while, but we're moving more and more to higher bands and higher frequencies. So 6 gigahertz is the new frontier for wide RF bandwidth that enables higher data rates. But wait, it gets better. In fact, we're looking at spectrum even in the 28 gigahertz range all the way to 100 gigahertz, because it's kind of a principle of physics and RF that the higher you go in frequency, it enables you to get a wider bandwidth. And a wider bandwidth translates to higher data rates. Even if you, as an individual person, may not need that high data rate, I can take that high data rate as a base station and serve more people with the data rates that they expect. So the framework we're putting up here is that we build on a nationwide, robust, well-deployed, well-optimized 4G network with Wi-Fi, and then layer on 5G in a progressive fashion. So I think it behooves me to talk a little more about LTE, 4G, and its evolution and what we're doing in that space. So on the top left, these are applications and use cases that we're quite familiar with, whether it's social media or downloading web pages, watching videos, either at home or in a vehicle. And then, massive multiplayer online gaming, security cameras, and then even vehicle-to-vehicle communication as we go forward will be enabled by LTE. The other thing that cellular is looking at is, besides, I think a speaker earlier in the day was talking about, rather than sending my data to the network, possibly to the cloud, and then it comes back down to send maybe an image to someone in the front row, I can maybe use cellular to directly communicate and even discover. So right now, the way you discover people with common interests is there are applications that will sit and say, okay, I like jazz, maybe she likes jazz, and I send my information up to the network with my GPS position. It computes that she's next to me, and she also likes jazz, and it knows her GPS location, and then it says, maybe you guys are interested in talking about jazz. Well, the cellular LTE direct mechanism that's listed there takes a better approach. It is a very low power mechanism. It is very efficient in terms of range, so I could cover maybe a 300 to 500 meter, about 1,000 foot area within which I can discover devices. And it can do it on a much larger scale than each of us sending our GPS coordinates to the network in a unicast fashion. And so I can discover that, I'm interested in ice cream, heavy metal, and soccer maybe, and find someone else, or maybe a couponing service or whatever to use that information. So LTE Direct is a very interesting area, both in terms of discovery as well as possibly in terms of communication. It's already been defined for public safety. It can be taken into commercial usage as well. The third piece is empowering new classes of service. So as people have realized that connectivity is a huge source of new growth and new value that they can add to the industries, things like ultra low latency in terms of communication is important for things like the energy grid. So if you have somewhere in the forest a tree falls and it takes down an overhead line, the electric grid has to actually, it's a big catastrophe for the electric grid to manage, because that outage in the forest can cause a chain reaction that can take out the whole western seaboard in terms of the electric grid. So you need millisecond style latencies to detect and communicate these faults so that the rest of the electric grid can react. And so that's an example of technological advancements in terms of lower latency enabling new use cases and bettering life. And then lastly, which has been the subject of a lot of discussion today, is LTE-M, or LTE machine type communication, aka IoT using cellular. And I'll spend a few slides going over that. So I think you've seen these projections before. By 2020, people expect of the order of 25 billion devices. And as you heard from some of the speakers today and subsequently during the day, these applications really transform industries. They transform smart city. They transform cities into smart cities. They transform health. They're going to transform healthcare, so on and so forth. So the question is, what do we do to enable connectivity for all these 25-odd billion devices? The answer is not a single point. It will require multiple connectivity solutions, ranging all the way from the personal area with things like Bluetooth, which we use today, moving into the local area with things like Wi-Fi, and then moving into the wider area with cellular. So it's going to be a melange of different solutions to solve the problem. Focusing in on the cellular side of things, we see LTE 4G as this mature, well-understood platform that can enable the requirements that machine-type communication have. So things like years of battery life, taking two AA cells, for example, putting it in a sensor in the field, and it sits there for 5 or 10 years doing its business without having to dig it up and change the battery. And then having low cost and low complexity devices. So instead of, of course, we've enabled the $800 smartphone. Now we have to talk about really low cost devices for smart meters and other applications. And then these smart meters could be sitting in a basement. We don't have them here in California, but it could be in a basement where it's very difficult for RF to propagate into, so we need deep coverage. And all these three things have been worked on within LTE, but the beauty of it is, rather than having an overlay network and an overlay system that is more expensive to manage and control and to unify, all these aspects can be delivered by the same LTE network that gives you a 15 megabits per second 4K video stream. So it's very powerful from an operator perspective and from a business case perspective. So if we look at the way that LTE is enabling IoT, the IoT applications down on the bottom of this slide span a wide variety of things. So if you look at it, you have things such as video surveillance, where you'd like to have, especially with higher quality, higher data rates of the order of 5 or 10 megabits per second, all the way down to possibly, let's say, a smart meter, right? Energy management. It wakes up for a really short time every day at a certain point in time and says, this guy has consumed this many extra kilowatt hours, right? And it goes back to sleep and does nothing else. And so to support this whole gamut of use cases and therefore requirements, LTE has LTE Advanced all the way on the left with multi-gigabit per second capabilities, all the way down to low cost, very high coverage, low data rate applications with what is called narrowband IoT. And then we also have LTE-M in the middle, which supports these use cases that don't necessarily go down to these super low data rates. So if we look at what LTE is doing, it is supporting the bread and butter use cases in terms of social media, video, connectivity, email, et cetera. It's also opening up new industries to connectivity. We talked about vehicle-to-vehicle, LTE discovery, et cetera. and is also supporting lower cost, massive scales of devices. So then the question becomes, where does 5G enter? In a sense, 5G will do very blandly, to put it very blandly, more of the same. But just as you could say that, hey, I had a smartphone back in 2007. It did the internet, it did email, it did phone calls. And now if I look at my cell phone here in 2015, 2016, it's vastly different. It is more of the same, but that more is so much more. And so from a 5G perspective, we're targeting a range of services and applications, just as 4G in its evolution are, which can be broadly categorized into three categories. There's mobile broadband, there's massive Internet of Things, and then there's ultra-reliable or mission-critical control. And so if we look at these use cases a little further, within the enhanced mobile broadband use case, I'll pick maybe a few. You can imagine that as we have things like Box and Dropbox and iCloud, et cetera, where your data is sitting in the cloud, and there is this feeling that when I want to access a file, it does take me some amount of time before I can actually access it. The tactile internet is really saying that you may have a bunch of data and assets in the cloud, but you feel like they're right at your fingertips. So basically low data, very high data rate applications enabled by multi-gigabit per second, 1 millisecond end-to-end latency style of kinds of requirements. Or broadband fiber to the home. So whereas we're used to running some kind of cable to the house to give you high data rates, we expect that 5G should be able to do so wirelessly. And then taking areas like stadiums where you have tens of thousands, maybe up to 100,000 people, all taking the winning goal or something else, and that those pictures are all being uploaded, or basically downloading videos of the game that you're following halfway across the country, enabling those highly dense environments. So basically enabling sort of today's use cases at a much larger scale. So that's what 5G is expected to do in the mobile broadband sphere. Within the massive Internet of Things area, it kind of mirrors the applications that we talked about in the 4G evolution sphere, but it does so with superlatives in terms of the numbers we're talking about as far as requirements. So if we take the electric meter that's sitting, or some kind of meter that's sitting in a basement, it can be termed as a kind of a link budget from the base station to that device, which 4G can penetrate. Let's call it, say, 5 kilometers. I'm just making that number up. It may not be real. With 5G, what we're aiming to do is introduce new techniques. For example, a managed mesh that takes that 5 kilometer number to something higher. And so basically taking each of the dimensions we have within massive Internet of Things, much more devices per unit square kilometer. So we're talking about like 1 million devices per things, connected things per square kilometer, or 160 dB plus link budget, or even data rates that range from tens of megabits per second to really low data rates, doing that much better. That's what 5G will do. And then lastly, from the use case buckets perspective, we have mission critical control. So there are use cases that are being thought of in terms of remote surgery. Why have a top doctor's talents restricted to the geographical area where that top doctor lives? You can basically have remote surgeries, even what we're looking at. Remember, this is 2020 plus. So 5G requires high reliability. You don't want that snip to be 1 millimeter to the left of where the surgeon intended it to be. So very high reliability of the link, very low latency, and then the ability to scale not just to one doctor, but maybe 10 doctors in the region. So that's an example of medical applications. Or let's take aviation. So drones are really popular. They're going to become even more popular with consumers. Well, what happens today is they're either controlled through Wi-Fi or some kind of proprietary link, and you fly your drone off, and then you see it go behind the building, and then you want it to come back, and the way back is by crashing, and you go look for it. So if you have cellular connectivity with very high reliability, very low latency, you can basically control it over much longer distances. In addition to, of course, the natural evolution of autonomy, wherein we're also working on intelligence in the drones so that when it goes out somewhere, it can calculate its path back autonomously without necessarily having the control over cellular. But if you do have control and if you can see the drone either through its camera or visually, you can bring it back through cellular. So those are two examples of mission-critical applications that 5G will enable. So in summary, today's LTE networks are a massive platform that enables today's use cases as well as emerging use cases. It expands into new industries and new services enabled by small cells, by Internet of Things features, and utilizing new spectrum types. 5G will take that firm foundation and build upon it in terms of use cases we can think of today that require more better technology, as well as things that you guys will think up in terms of applications and use cases that the technology has to be able to support. And so together with 4G and its evolution and then 5G, we think we can connect new industries and devices, enable new services, and empower new user experiences. Thanks. Question? Right, I think to summarize the question is there are multiple dimensions of advancements such as multi-gigabit per second, lower latency, high reliability. Will 5G enable service providers to combine those differently? Absolutely. So the challenge actually, if you look at that fan out of 5G use cases, and if you decompose them into requirements, we say that those requirements have diverse and actually sometimes antipodal requirements. And so what the challenge we have is to fit them all into, we think about it as a chessboard, where you design the grid so that the pawn can move and do its its thing in small increments, but do its job, at the same time as the queen can swish up and down the board and do whatever she needs to do to kill the opposing things. And so what I'm getting at is, yes, 5G will enable a framework that allows you to go all the way on one dimension or to pick some operating point across those three dimensions.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks.